Hey, I'm Yo Bob, the developer of Harvest Island, and my game is made in RPG Maker MV. RPG Maker has a very bad history of making bad games, and it's mostly because it's such a low entry into game development. There's no programming involved, and all the art needed is given to you to make games quickly. That's why I regret making my game in RPG Maker MV. When was the last time a good game was released in RPG Maker? It was when Omori was released. Omori is appraised for its psychological horror, and it was made in RPG Maker MV just like my game. Another game before Omori, To the Moon series, and that was released in 2011 and all the way to 2021. There are other successes, but none come close to holding a candle to those games. There are thousands of games made in RPG Maker, and their success isn't as great since most developers using RPG Maker don't have a strong programming skill, or they're just using the default art given to the developers when buying the engine. The point I'm trying to make is, when making a game in RPG Maker, your game is destined to fail if you're not a highly skilled developer with a good talented team behind your back. The history of this engine backs it up. Compare this to Unity or Unreal, it's no wonder that most developers want to commercialize their game would go into that engine instead of RPG Maker. And I regret making my game in RPG Maker MV. Knowing all of the history of RPG Maker and its many unsuccessful games made in it wasn't something I was thinking about when I started my game. I was mostly learning how games were made and was too excited to make my first game with zero knowledge I had back then. If I were to go back in time and tell myself in the past, hey, make your game in Godot or Unity or even in Unreal, I'd do it. But I'm stuck with RPG Maker, and I've been designing in this engine for 4 years. I really want to switch to Godot, as Godot 4.0 is coming soon, but I have Harvest Island I have to finish first. That doesn't mean I don't enjoy designing in Harvest Island. I love my game and I can't wait for it to come out, even if it is designing in RPG Maker MV, but it comes with a huge drawback, and this is why I regret making it in RPG Maker. There are complex designs I have to think about when designing a game mechanic. For example, if I wanted to make a farming type game, I would have to think about if it's even possible to do a farming game in RPG Maker. Luckily, I found my answer after weeks of testing, figuring out the engine's capabilities, and thinking outside of the box, in which programmers would never even try to think about because it's too cumbersome to do. But I did it, and it was very cumbersome. That's why my game is taking quite a long time to be released, and also because the quality of the game needs to be at a higher standard for it to sell. Let me break down what that cumbersome of a job I had to do in order to get that farming mechanic implemented to the best of this engine could do. There are 4 problems I had to figure out when implementing a farm mechanic. Animation. Without this, you wouldn't even know if the crops are growing or ready to be picked. Programming. How would I make the crops grow given that my game has a day-night cycle that can go on forever? How to design the farming fields. This is important because I had to make a choice of giving the option of planting anywhere on your farm versus planting on a certain area. The reason I had to think about this was because of the game's engine limits. 4. Designing a fun gameplay around the farming mechanic and if it can support the story of the game. Luckily, I managed to solve all these issues and implement it in the game. But do you know how cumbersome of a thought process I had to do because of the game's engine limitations? It's not about I think this is cool to put this farming feature into Harvest Island, it's more about can I do it? Even though it's cool to have it in there, my problem becomes can I even put it in there? In Unity or Unreal, or probably in Godot, I could do this with just 100 lines of code. I'm not too sure if it's just 100 lines of code, could be more or less, versus RPG Maker's line of code that I had to do, 1000 plus. And these codes are jumping all over the place. It's just faster to make it in another engine. This makes it a really big nightmare if I wanted to expand on it because editing or fixing a bug takes a long time to find. It's like finding a needle in a haystack and making sure that needle becomes hay, and putting it back together and making sure that the cows can eat it. Very cumbersome and time consuming. A long time ago, I posted my game on Reddit, and the RPG Maker community wanted to know how I implemented a farming mechanic to my game, because that has never been done before, or at least I have not found a game that tries to do it what I'm doing. I told the guy I couldn't explain it to him because of all the complex workarounds. Those 4 topics I talked about, finding a solution to those problems was a nightmare and long hours I had to do. If I made a progress of just 1 step, I had to make sure my back steps were good or else I would end up having bugs all over my game. To this day, I'm terrified of finding bugs in my game because that's just one step closer of trashing my farming mechanic or redoing my entire farming mechanic. That is such a nightmare, but luckily it hasn't come to that. Isn't that just terrifying to work with? A game engine so limited that it just makes it or breaks it for a game mechanic to be in or out just based on a bug. This is why I hate RPG Maker so much. It's so limited and I regret it so much. My farming mechanic isn't where you can step on the crops and little crops move to the side like Stardew Valley. It's really static and limited, and that's the trade-off I had to do when designing it in RPG Maker. You can still farm, grow your crops, water it, and harvest it, but the animation is limited. And I still blame it on my entire engine. They say a game is good not because of the game's engine, but it's because of the person making it. Well, I hope I'm just as good to live up to that status quo. I'm just very thankful for the other farming simulators out there that has established what farming genre is. Without that, my direction of designing what is barely acceptable in a farming game would be an adventure to explore, and a lot of experiment, which I probably can't afford as an indie solo game developer. Even though I'm facing a lot of limitations and workaround for my game, I think that's just part of game development, but the amount I have to go through is not fun. I've designed my game to overcome a lot of hurdles and what RPG Maker shouldn't be capable of doing. It's just a lot of ingenuity from my part in making the game fun. Because what makes a game fun is good music, believable fantasy, and some type of goal in that game. In this case for my game, farming to progress the story. Even though I didn't design my game in an RPG fashion like how the engine was designed to be, I've decided to use the strongest part of the game's feature, and that's eventing, which is pretty much coding for a non-coder. And there are severe limitations to that as well. The eventing is designed for a basic to moderate gameplay, but I took it to the next level and have lines and lines of complete eventing codes with the exterior codes called plugins to help get what I want across in designing my game. I really hate RPG Maker. Very cumbersome. Throughout my entire development, I've always emphasized my game to be a story-driven farming simulator. Even the demo I frequently update tells what the game should be. The farming is to help support the game's progression. You can still build, upgrade your farm, and raise your livestock, but the main goal of Harvest Island will be exploring rather than dating and raising a family. This is why I wanted to talk about why my game is an RPG Maker. It's because of the severe limitations I had to overcome to design a farming game. This game may not be the traditional Harvest Moon dating type farm life game, but it's unique enough to branch out from that farming game tradition and do something entirely different. This game engine's limitations forced me to design Harvest Island into a non-dating game and more of a story-driven game. I've learned quite a bit from using RPG Maker as my game engine to design Harvest Island, but I think I will never design another game in it ever again. My friend says my potential is being wasted on this engine. I couldn't agree more. Well, let's see what happens when my game gets released. Let's see if I even have the potential to make my next game. And I'm Yobob, the developer of Harvest Island, and thanks for watching.